What's up, everybody, and welcome back. We're going from zero to producer in 90 days with Ableton Live. I'm your instructor, Torbjorn. Big thanks to Ableton for extending that free trial up to 90 days. While we're all in quarantine, we can focus our minds on something productive and creative. Very thankful for that. This video is going to be all about turning sounds into vintage or retro sounding samples. Before we do that, let's just quickly review what we talked about in the last lesson. We were digging into the fundamentals of the simpler instrument, super powerful sampler with lots of tools and submenus. We learned a couple tips. The things that I use this instrument for the most are the different loop modes, the filter circuit and the shaper that's built into it, the pitch envelope. We're able to do some frequency modulation with the oscillator, and of course, customizing the pitch bend range. Let's dive into it. How to make stuff sound like vintage samples. The first thing that we got to talk about is this concept of timbre. It's widely accepted that the fundamentals of music are rhythm, melody, and harmony. That's what makes up a composition, a song, a beat, can be pretty much structured within those three things. However, in our modern day, there's a school of thought that believes that timbre is that fourth fundamental of making music. And what timbre is it refers to the unique characteristics and qualities of a sound. For example, the difference between a Yamaha piano and a Steinway piano in terms of its sound, that difference of timbre is what makes them unique. Timbre is that very important quality of a sound. Because we're recording and we're making MP3s and WAV files, we're in charge of shaping that timbre as producers and musicians. So we're in control of representing that timbre in a way that's enjoyable or relevant to the listener. The quality or the accuracy of this translation is referred to as fidelity or sound quality. So because art and music is subjective, there's no rules about what fidelity is the right fidelity. Some people want to hear a recording that sounds like they're in the same room, hearing that sound with their own ears. And some people want like an old school or a retro sound of like a vinyl record or a cassette tape. All kinds of different eras of recording technology that we can reproduce intentionally for creative purposes. So in this one, we're going to be more looking at the latter of those two examples, how to make an old school sound or a retro sound, something that feels like it's coming off of a cassette tape or a vinyl record. So let's look at how to achieve that. A couple top tips here. So the first thing that we need to know is we need to have some context. We need to pick the right samples, and we need to pick sounds that make sense when they sound lo-fi. So if we were to do that with like modern dubstep sounds or modern synthesizers, that might not make sense because contextually, we've not heard those sounds on those old cassette recordings or those old vinyl recordings. But when we're talking about instruments like pianos and guitars or vintage synthesizers and vintage drum machines, things from like the 90s and the 80s and before, those things we're familiar hearing with those old cassette recordings and that old kind of like crappy quality, if you will. So those things make sense for us to use with these kind of techniques. Let's take a listen to the sample choice here. I've got some drums. I've layered some claps, keyboard, and a bass. We can isolate those things and listen to them a little bit. And I've got these Spectrum audio effects pulled up so we can see kind of the EQ graph of what sounds we're using. So I'll start by just isolating these sounds and we can hear what sounds are coming from where. Here's the drum loop. On top of that, I layered some claps. And we've got this keyboard sample. Interesting enough, this sample already has some of that crackly vinyl sound on it. So we get some of that for free just from the sample choice, which is nice. And then I've chopped up this little bass line here from an acoustic bass. So that's everything all together with no lo-fi effects on it yet. That's just our starting point. To quote Mark Ronson, everything sounds better pitched down. was from one of his TED Talks, and that guy's music is phenomenal, so it must be right. So I pitched everything down a little bit from, I believe we were in G flat, and I pitched everything down to F. If we look at the difference here on our spectrum analyzer, pitching it down moves the entire frequency range down. And what that means in terms of our timbre is we have less high pitch or high frequency stuff. So by definition, it's going to lose some of that intelligibility. Then the next thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to distort and compress. So here's what this sounds like with a little distortion and compression. Now let's dig in here a little bit and look at what I did, starting with one instrument at a time. On the drums, the first thing I did is I threw this through a saturator, put it on a hard curve, and that has a pretty abrasive sound even without turning the drive up. So all I did was reduce the output so it didn't get louder and turned the dry wet down to about 50% so it wasn't completely that distorted signal. I went in here and used this drum sharpener preset from the drum bus. That just helps that initial transient sound. The sound of the stick hitting the drum gets louder. I took the dry wet of that down a little bit as well because I liked the effect but didn't completely want it to overpower or overcook our sound. And last but not least, I distorted some of that low end around where the bass and the kick and the snare drum hits. Turned the tone up quite a bit on the overdrive effect so that we get a lot of overtones from those frequencies that are starting in that area. But we took the dry wet knob down quite low so that we were balancing most of that out of the sound and just getting a little bit of enhancement. We did kind of the same thing to the clap here, except we added a little bit of reverb and some subtle chorus to help get that sound out of the middle. And then I just did the same trick with the hard curd saturator. Gives it the sense of a bunch of people standing in a room together. Here on the keys track, threw it through a cabinet, so we got the sound of those keyboards coming out of a speaker. Then we put it through an amp after the cabinet, which is a little bit of an odd technique. But that amp is just adding some high frequency presence all the way up, so we're just getting a brighter sound. Compressed it with the OTT. This is my custom OTT settings. I've messed with the amount and with the time quite a bit. And normally a OTT has the output on the high frequency up quite high. So I just reduced that, and then I got rid of a lot of the bass. Then we threw an overdrive effect here on the end of the chain just to give it a little bit of extra growly sound in that mid-range. And with all of those effects, it brings out that crackly sound that was in the sample to begin with, which I thought was really nice. This is probably the trickiest one of all, the bass. I used a saturator here with the Sinoid fold, which is a very, very subtle saturation, just adding some extra overtones from those really low pitches. Down here with the color effects, you can kind of hone in what frequencies you want it to focus on and distort in different ways. And of course, I went down here to 90 hertz down in the sub-frequency range. Added a little bit of extra growly sound with this erosion effect using the sine mode. Did my custom OTT on it again, threw it through an amp, threw it through a cabinet, and just really smashed and squashed our bass sound with lots of distortion and compression. And now it sounds like this. It does a lot of stuff to enhance the sound. If we listen to our pitched down version and look at our spectrum analyzer, we've got this nice curve, lots of low frequencies, kind of getting a little bit quieter up towards the high frequencies, and the distortion and compression just starts to bring some of that back and control some of those mid-range frequencies again. That's great, but saturation adds a lot of extra harmonic content, and a lot of times that can achieve that lo-fi sound, but it also can get really messy sounding. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to clean things up with an EQ. So here we've got an EQ8. We've EQ'd the drums, we've EQ'd the clap, getting rid of a lot of bass from all of the sounds that aren't that bass sound by using a filter, controlling some of the mids, making some of the highs louder or quieter where appropriate. Like we don't need a lot of high frequencies on the bass, but we definitely do want it with the drums and keyboards, for example. So after we've cleaned everything up with EQs, it sounds like this. I think the thing that is affected the most by cleaning that stuff up with the EQ is the high end, the clarity in the mid-range, and then getting rid of stuff that doesn't need to have that low-end content so that the bass isn't fighting for space as much. Last but not least, we want to throw some stuff on the whole group. I've used this vinyl distortion and done some pretty extreme EQing here with the EQ8 to really accentuate the lo-fi, getting rid of a lot of those high frequencies and getting rid of almost all of the bass. Let's see what that sounds like. So depending on your tastes, you might want to back off some of those effects. We went really, really lo-fi there at the end. And for your track, this may be overcooked. So just understand what the different effects do and mess with the amount of distortion, mess with the dry-wet mix on those audio effects if you want to increase the amount of like lo-fi that we're giving it, or if you want to decrease that, just know how to do that with the gain, with the EQs, with the dry-wet mix. Let's listen back to our original samples. And compare with our end result. So lo-fi sounding, I love it. I want to dig into this idea of adding harmonics with our saturator effect. The easiest way that I know how to do this is by using a sine wave. So we use saturation in this example to reduce the fidelity, but if you understand how it works, you can actually increase the perceived sound quality depending on how you use it. So let's use a sine wave and a saturator audio effect so we know what's happening with saturation versus compression, like using an OTT, for example. So if you've got headphones, you'll want to put them on, or if you've got full range speakers, we're going to play just a low-pitched sine wave real quick. You can see here that it's basically just a big single frequency here at F, about 44 hertz. As we add this saturator and turn the drive way up, we've got all these different modes here: analog clip, soft sine, medium, hard curve, etc., etc. As you go down the list, they start to get a little bit more buzzy. So let's take a listen to what drive with analog clip sounds like and what it does to our frequencies. So you can see here, we've got all these extra spikes on our spectrum analyzer. These are the overtones. So we're pushing this sound, we're driving it up in volume past the point where it can't get any louder, and it's causing that nice round sine wave becoming more square at its edges. Similar to if we were to just change the type of wave it was from a sine wave to a sawtooth or a square wave, we would get those extra overtones. We're achieving that with more variables by using our saturator effect. So that's analog clip. Let's listen to soft sine. Now we're really hearing this first harmonic. Ooh. That frequency really starts to jump out and become more audible. Let's listen to medium. Starting to get that kind of like round sound is disappearing. It's becoming a little buzzier. And now let's look at our hard curve. Lots of overtones, really, really buzzy. You can see until we get up to about 2K on our spectrum analyzer, it really is like adding a lot of overtones. So adding those extra frequencies from clipping is what's happening when we're using a saturator. The difference between saturation and compression is that saturation causes new frequencies to be added or to be to occur within the signal. Compression is just going to change the volume or the like tonal dispersion between high and low of the sound that's already there. So let's put an OTT on the end of our hard curve, which sounds like this without the OTT. Everything above 2K is pretty quiet, but once we compress it, you can see that all of those extra harmonic frequencies up top become really, really loud and really, really buzzy. But if we were to take our saturator off and have an OTT on there, we're really not getting a whole lot of overtones except for just some of the stuff that's naturally occurring in that sine wave. Last but not least, I wanted to show you a lo-fi hack. With the right combination and settings, Ableton Audio Effects can give us some amazing tools to manipulate timbre and fidelity. But when it's time to make something sound like a lo-fi sample really fast, there's nothing quite like XLN Audio's RC20 plugin. $99 puts this plugin in the lower mid price range as far as plugins go, and it comes with tons of presets and easy to use controls. Splice offers it rent to own for $9.99 a month. Oh, I'm wrong. It's actually $4.99 a month for 20 months. So you pay a couple bucks a month. As long as you keep paying, you get access to the plugin. Let's take a listen again to our original example. This is everything with the pitch down, the distortion, the compression, and cleaned up with EQs, but we've taken the group effects off. And here's what it sounds like. And now let's take a look at that with RC20, the vinyl 1 preset turned on. And there's tons of different presets. Vinyl 4 is pretty similar sounding to the one that we achieved with the Ableton Audio Effects, but there's some just little bit of extra depth that comes with this plugin. It's really great. You can use this magnitude knob here to dial back the dry wet of the entire plugin, or you can use these individual knobs to dial in the dry wet of the individual effects. You can add noise, you can add wobble, which changes the pitch of your recording, little up and down pitch over time. You can distort it with all kinds of different types of distortion. You can add digital distortion, spatial processing like reverb, magnetic processing, giving it kind of a tape compression effect. It's just all kinds of awesome stuff. And not to mention, they've got a lot of presets in here as well. Gotta love RC20. If you can afford to drop a couple bucks on a plugin, this is your secret tool for the lo-fi audio effect. That's all we got for today. Hopefully this was an easy and quick technique that gave you some like really cool tricks up your sleeve for when you want to reduce the fidelity or when you want to use saturation and compression and just understand a little bit better about what it's doing and what knobs to twist and how to do things individually to tracks versus how to affect a group of tracks to put them all in one sonic universe. So remember, timbre describes characteristic of a sound and fidelity describes how we translate that timbre to the listener. So when you understand these two concepts and you start to play with them, that's when we get that kind of fourth pillar of what makes music composition, when the characteristic and quality and translation of those sounds can become as important to your composition as some of the basic foundations like rhythm and melody and harmony. Thanks again to Ableton for 90 days of Ableton Live 10 Suite. Happy producing. Make lots of beats and have fun. Peace out.